Hi everyone, it's Nancy Guppy. I'm out here on the deck. Behind me is this fantastic vintage 7-Up sign. And joining me on iPhone camera is of course the one and only Joe Guppy.
Hi everybody.
And that is Joe's hand. I like to point that out for some oddball reason. And this is Art Zone Phones It In, which is a socially distanced version of Art Zone that has been airing on the Seattle channel for over 10 years. Okay, about a year and a half ago, January 2019 to be exact, I interviewed poet Quenton Baker about Ballast, his visually poetic exhibit at Frye Art Museum. Now, Ballast was based on a true story that is strikingly prescient to what is happening currently with the Black Lives Matter movement. And so with that in mind, we decided to dedicate this episode to a replay of that 2019 interview with Quenton, followed up by a Zoom conversation that we recorded in early July. Also in this show is the Dynamite Band, Stephanie Ann Johnson and the Hidogs. They've got a new single coming out. It's called American Blues. And we've got Stephanie here performing a stripped down version of the song. So that's the plan. And we'll begin with Quenton Baker from 2019. Well, first of all, a museum exhibit, the first ever. Congratulations, crew.
Thank you.
You can all clap. Congratulations. It's a big deal.
Thank you.
So, Quenton, let's start with what Ballast is based on, right? The 1841 slave revolt aboard the ship Creole. Tell me that story. I'm unfamiliar with this story.
Yeah, so in 1841, by then the United States had banned the transatlantic slave trade. So what was taking place was called the coastwise or secondary slave trade, where people were being sold from the upper South, further south. So the Creole was one of those ships. In 1841, it departed from Virginia on its way to New Orleans. And it was 19 people led by a man named Madison Washington, which is kind of absurd. But Madison Washington and 18 other people commandeered the ship and forced the crew to pilot it to Nassau, because Nassau was a British colony and Britain had abolished the slave trade. So anyone who landed on British soil was not recognized as chattel.
As a slave, they were free.
Right.
Wow, wow. When you learned this story, how did that feel to you?
Well, I think the thing that stuck out was that I hadn't heard about it.
Yeah, right.
I consider myself like, I don't have a PhD in history, but I consider myself in my creative work as someone who's invested in research and invested in history. And so the fact that I hadn't come across what was the only successful large-scale revolt involving American-born enslaved people ever was kind of, I was like, what? So it really just sparked my curiosity to figure out more, as much as I could, about what happened.
Yeah. So the revolt inspired you to create this exhibit, includes new poems, right, as well as historical documents that you have altered using a poetic technique called erasure. So first, what are the historical documents that you used, and then explain or describe erasure?
Yeah, so the documents are Senate records from the second session of the 27th Congress in 1842. They're depositions and they're letters back and forth from members of the US government and members of the British government in Nassau, just that detail all of the proceedings. Because what happened after the ship ran aground in Nassau was that the United States sued Britain for loss of cargo. So
loss of the people, i.e. cargo, gotcha.
Right, so they sued them for I think $200,000. So these documents were critical to that court case, and they were critical to like how the United States was adjudicating itself in this Creole affair.
Right.
So it's the only living record, and it's a record from a dominant perspective, and a perspective that's invested in a certain outcome, in this case, like winning the court case.
We want our stuff, right.
So I wanted to apply this technique, this erasure technique or redaction, because to me, it was a way to excavate this lost speech. There was 135 people that gained their freedom. No one went and talked to anyone. No one went and recorded Madison Washington's version of events. So this was the only speech.
Way to get the story. When you are doing the erasure or the redaction, how do you choose the words or the phrases that you want people, like anyone who comes to the exhibit, to see?
Yeah, so this is, there's a lot of different ways that one could go about it. For me, it was looking for then something that would echo the kind of utterances that were lost, the kind of perspectives and interiority that was ignored and that people were uninterested in, or rather required to not exist. So really it was about finding language that, to me, got at that sense of recovery or that sense of redress.
Why did you choose the title of Ballast? What does that mean for this exhibit?
So Ballast Ballast is still in use today. It's just it just means that it's the placeholder weight for cargo. And so in the 1840s, for human cargo, they would have used most likely large iron bars. And the bars are loaded into the ships, they get into the port, the bars are taken out, and the cargo is loaded on. And so partially, I chose Ballast because of how benign it is, to highlight the fact that a ship full of people is just a cargo ship. It had a standard manifest, a standard form that was filled out with names and ages and skin tones, like any other manifest would have been. So there's the banality of it, but also there's the component of the concept of counterweight and the ways in which historically and currently Blackness and Black people are asked and, well, commanded to be counterweight for our own destruction, or a placeholder for our own destruction. The controlling image of Black people as violent and as aggressive and as dangerous becomes the very excuse and the very reason why you could die. So that concept of ballast, that concept of the counterweight, of a placeholder for your own kind of freight, for that kind of weight, also came into play.
Quenton Baker, thanks so much for Zooming with me.
Thank you for having me.
It's great to see you. So in the Poetry of Ballast, your exhibit at Frye Art Museum, you excavated language to give voice to people like rebel leader Madison Washington, who were given no historical voice. So with today's protests, in what ways do you see fresh voices being listened to, and in what way do you see people continuing to be silenced?
Yeah, that's a tough one. I think first I want to clarify that for me, it was less about giving voice to Madison Washington and more pointing at an absence or gesturing towards the absence, because I can't presume to speak for him or to know what his voice would have been. And I think in that way is also, I think my answer to the second part of that question is that, there's that quote from Zora Neale Hurston where, paraphrasing, if you let it, this word will kill you, and say that you enjoyed it. So in the absence of your own voice, in the absence of your own perspective being on record, anyone can say anything about you. And so what we see now, with things like Twitter, with this, the plurality of voices that are available and on public record, easily searchable, as long as the internet stays up, then you have, there can be no forced absence of that kind. You can put your voice on a kind of record, and how much that matters, how much that affects things, how much that changes things, I don't know. But I just think that possibility and that reality, because part of my struggle with this project was there was nothing to go to. There wasn't an archive, there wasn't a record. And that's not the case now, which I think is, if anything, that's something that's better.
Well, as you said, there are a lot of words being said right now. by the victims of violence, by pundits, protesters, politicians on the right and the left. As a poet and a writer, are there any words or phrases that stand out to you?
Yeah, I think I was just looking at this poll earlier from Monmouth, where it said that 77% of people think that when they hear defund the police, they don't think abolish the police or get rid of the police. They think move money around. And for me, that's been one of the shifts that has been interesting, is because I remember, in 2014 with the protests around Freddie Gray and then Renisha McBride and Michael Brown, that whole 2014 to 2016 kind of era. It was abolish the police was this fringe phrase that only radicals were using. And then when, or people that were considered radical. And then, in this recent spate of protests, abolish the police was front and center. And now, but as things have gone on, abolish the police has shifted ever so subtly, not that subtly, to defund the police, which is a fundamentally different call and a fundamentally different drive. So I think the ways in which power and hegemony, like the way that asserts itself over language, is it's never ending. And it's as a poet, I think like you always have to be on watch for how language is moving and how influence is exerted upon it and how it changes, what things mean. And so that's one of the things that I've been paying, I think, the most attention to.
So your poems contain many powerful visual images and juxtapositions, and a couple of examples I want to mention from I Ran From It. Forced knuckles bust clay, and then what? Am I fist or earth? And from Love Longs for an Object, I lay hands on a chest that shivers and quakes like a pyramid of handcuffs. Very powerful imagery. How do these images and phrases come to you? Do you painstakingly put them together? I mean, how can you describe kind of your process?
Yeah, I think for me, I consider myself very interested in the alchemical properties of language, which for me are sound and image. So I typically go to sound first. I let sound drive. I mean, I have a background in music, so like the rhythm of a word is typically what drives me. I'm constantly fascinated by how close or how related the syncopation of a word or a phrase can match its meaning, or how those two things inform each other. So yeah, I'm very closely driven by sound. And then also I love to try and make things as new as possible, to try and refresh language as much as possible. One of my favorites is Anne Sexton, and her images always just, blew my mind. The first time I read them and the 30th time I read them, there was something brand new in them. And that desire drives me along with the sound.
Now, you highlighted the banality of evil in Ballast as well. The title refers to human beings treated as cargo, inert cargo. We now have an image burned in our minds of George Floyd being murdered by a policeman kneeling casually with his hand in his pocket, which is chilling. What do you think, as an artist, is the most effective way to address the banality of evil?
Yeah, so I mean that's kind of my whole practice is built around in a lot of ways, but not just the banality of evil, but also the reality of trauma. Because for me, the way that you show the banality of evil or the reality of like social life is through looking at the interior of the people who are most affected. I think that in anything, be it poetry or history, or sociology, the view from the bottom is always the one that is the most accurate and the most precise. So I think for me, that project has meant, my first book, it meant a lot of persona poems, like literal interiority, and in Ballast, it meant more of trying to focus on, because if it's the banality of evil, then it shows up in the mundane, it shows up in the everyday. It's in every possible action, it's in every possible interaction. So for me, it's about not showing the big moments. Fred Moten recently said on a podcast that he doesn't know a Black person who hasn't died from anti-Blackness, and he doesn't know a Black person who won't die from anti-Blackness. So it's like George Floyd died from a policeman's knee on his neck, but you could also look at a million other incidents in George Floyd's life in which anti-Blackness put him in the position that he would eventually end up with a policeman's knee on his neck, because not every person ends up with a policeman's knee on their neck, but every Black person ends up structurally destroyed by the way that anti-Blackness functions. So I think showing the mundane, showing the everyday, showing like waiting 5 hours in line to vote in Mississippi, this structurally is the same thing that leads to a knee on the neck. And so it's in that mundane, seemingly banal moment that you can illustrate banality of evil, what that really looks like.
Well, Quenton, thank you so much for talking with us. I really appreciate it. And I was hoping that we could close with you reading a poem, if you're up for it.
Of course. Can't be a poet and decline reading a poem. I'll read from the manuscript that the Frye exhibition was taken from.
Great.
Which is now done, surprisingly. The coffle grottos the blood, thrum language pump subterranean, flesh made lexical, dehoused from fieldstone. We demand the earth return us, in the grammar of bone-spitting oak, in the grammar of limb-chewing wave, erupt the firing pin, collapse trigger until it resembles an unlit waning, an unhitched wailing. We will not modulate or vary the tone, a suturing shout, in ununison, broad stalactite of threat and futurity. The dirt is a dialect we drip underneath, we lustral blood bearers, perfecters of spill, unkillable fugitive dead, our eluded flesh, cleansed of every grope and clench, our rack-weighted cots slashed and wrapped in asafoetida, black market of redress. We donate one another to ourselves, the proceeds of survival, assemblage in wave, the elision of the hold, to occupy the bad left between break and escape, between breach and too much. Yes, we will cut the head off a snake, build panorama from its end, treat scrap of planet like juniper seed.
Beautiful. Thank you so much. Thank you. Take care of yourself, Quenton.
You too.
Okay. Learn more about Quenton and pick up his book of poetry, This Glittering Republic, from his website, quentonbaker.com. Time now for some music, and you are in for such a treat. Stephanie Ann Johnson and the Hidogs is a band out of Tacoma. Their star is definitely on the rise. They've got a new single. It's called American Blues. It drops later this month. And here is Stephanie with a solo acoustic version of the song.
I've been sad, I've been blue, I've been dying all over you. You've been washed in my blood. Oh, these years. tell me to be strong. Hold the line, soldier on. I've been weary, but renewed to compose these American blues.
American Blues from Stephanie Ann Johnson and the Hidogs drops as a single on Friday, July 24th, and will be available on Bandcamp and all digital platforms with the accompanying music video streaming on YouTube. Get access to everything at stephanieannjohnsonmusic.com. And that's a wrap. Thanks so much for dropping by. And until we meet again, remember the 3 S's. Stay healthy, stay safe, and stay masked, if you can get it on. That'll do it.